There are three things photographers often miss, and they can be the difference between stunning landscapes and boring ones. In this video, I'm showing you what they are so you can create interesting photos to be proud of from every shoot. But first, it's important to understand why even the most stunning sunrise or sunset won't save a boring photo, and the two reasons it can actually make one worse. So how can awesome conditions possibly make a landscape worse? Well, when you're lucky enough to actually capture one of these rare explosions of colours in the sky, the deep saturated reds and yellows can quickly overwhelm the entire scene, to the point where the whole thing just looks the same and nothing really stands out. The second way that more colours can make a landscape worse is when there are too many different colours all competing with each other and your eye gets dragged all around the frame by them because there's just so much going on. Now, to find out if your colourful landscapes are missing any of these three elements that turn them from boring to beautiful, there's a quick test you can do in Photoshop or Lightroom to check what might be missing. So here it is. Have a look at what it looks like in black and white. Because if a landscape looks flat and boring in black and white, then it will probably look flat and boring in colour. Take this example where I convert this original raw image to black and white. Now, although it's full of colour in the original, in black and white we can see that it looks flat, mushy and uninspiring. Now compare that to this edited version where I've added two of the three secret elements in Photoshop, and the black and white version looks much more dynamic and interesting. So, what is it that was missing? When you emphasize the contrast between light and dark areas and you have a strong range of tones in between, then your landscapes will pop more and become even more compelling. Now looking at these two, we can see that the contrast and the tonal range is the clear difference between the two versions, looking at them side by side. Now for this image, I did this in Photoshop, but you can give yourself a head start by thinking about it much earlier in the process, way back when you're capturing a photo to begin with. Now, instead of being distracted and attracted to just photographing the stunning colours, study what the light is actually doing rather than where the colours are being displayed. And consider what angle the light's coming from and what objects it hits and what object is lighting up and where the shadows are being cast. And then think about how you can use all of this to make certain elements in the frame pop and stand out. For instance, early in the morning, the light can cast long shadows that add depth and dimension to your scene. And light coming in from the side is going to highlight and enhance detail in texture in interesting objects. So think about how you can position yourself in relation to those shadows and light to enhance the apparent depth in certain objects and elements. This is just one of the ingredients that helps create the feeling that you can step right into your finished picture. But when it comes to injecting depth into your landscape photos, there's another big challenge which this next point will help you solve. And the challenge is this. How do we actually express three-dimensional depth in a two-dimensional photo on screen or in print? Well, like we just covered, you can get part of the way there if you have great contrast and tonal range in general, but there are two more ways to take depth to the next level in your landscapes. One of them you can do in editing, but if you get it wrong, which I see a lot of, it'll actually make your landscapes more flat and more boring. So I'll show you the right way to edit for depth in just a second. If you haven't downloaded my Photoshop action yet, which lets you create depth masks automatically, then grab it for free from the link in the description and pinned comment. More on editing in a second, because again, the first way comes much earlier in the process, back when you're composing your scene in the camera. Instead of shooting wide open to capture an entire epic vista, like so many people do, and which is why so many people have similar boring shots that capture everything but show nothing, a simple trick for composing an image with great depth is to consciously place something in the foreground and something in the background. Now I know this sounds basic, but it isn't supposed to be complicated. Now with that said, that doesn't mean simply angling your camera to include a foreground and to include a background, because there's a big difference between that and actually having a point of interest in the foreground and a point of interest in the background. This landscape here, for example, has a foreground and it has a background, but the image still looks kind of flat. This one, on the other hand, has a strong point of interest in the foreground and in the background, and as we scan the image from up close to far away, that's what enhances the sense of depth and distance in the scene. So we'll expand on this more in the third main point later in the video, but first let's talk about how you can inject depth into a scene in editing. So to demonstrate, let me share a quick little experiment. Now here's a quick sketch I made in Photoshop of three identical mountains using only grey brushes to paint them, so without all the colour, all we have is light and shape. Now let me ask you, which of these three mountains looks further away and which looks closest? Alright, trick question. They all objectively look the same distance because they're all literally identical. But when I make this one here lighter, does it start to look closer or further away? And what happens when I make this one darker along with the foreground? Well, what happens is it seems like it's getting closer to us. This is just a simple demo that eliminates color and uses the basic light and shapes, but it proves the fundamental idea that you can use brightness and contrast to enhance depth and to create distance between things. Now, here's a real-world example, starting with what I would say is a pretty flat edit. So there's not really any depth to the elements in this image because they're all kind of the same brightness values. Now, here's an improved edit that treats the foreground and background elements differently based on their distance and how far away they are. Now, there is a lot of crossover between the first point that I shared about light and contrast and this one about depth and distance, because they're both about light. And another crossover is the fact that in good lighting, a lot of this depth and distance will be injected into the photo for you naturally. But the mistake that I see so many people making, which destroys this natural depth that already existed in their raw file, is when they edit all the different elements in the scene the same regardless of the distance. So they'll edit a distant mountain to have the same amount of contrast and brightness and saturation as something in the foreground in an attempt to make everything pop. But in giving everything the same light and contrast regardless of distance, the depth is lost and it results in a slightly paradoxical, contrasty but flat image. Now, you can have something in the foreground and have something in the background, but unless your composition has this next thing, it could still end up being boring. So this third ingredient of an interesting landscape is probably the most important one of all. So here it is. A landscape photo will be boring if it's not about anything. What on earth does that mean? Well, if someone asks you, what's that a photo of? And your answer is the landscape, then it's probably a boring photo. Now, having a good composition that follows, say, the rule of thirds isn't enough to make it interesting just in and of itself. Pointing the camera in the general direction of an epic vista and lining up the horizon with the rule of thirds is not the same as carefully constructing a composition that has a clear point of interest that tells a story. Now, this is a pretty big topic, and with all the various rules and guidelines of what makes a good composition, it can get a bit overwhelming, but there is a simple trick that you can use to solve this and instantly improve your compositions, even if you normally struggle to see the shot. And you can discover what that is when you watch this next video.